Christmas, 1989. While the world unwrapped gifts, Romania unwrapped the end of a tyrant. Nicolae Ceausescu, so feared his people barely whispered his name. At his side, Elena, his wife, his iron shadow. Together, they ruled through fear, through silence, through control. But empires don't last forever. In a single day, it all collapsed. Trial rushed, verdict sealed, and bullets fired. This is the story of how Elena Ceausescu met her end. The bullets tore through her body and ended her life in minutes. But the execution on Christmas Day of 1989 did not just end a life. It shattered the myth of a woman who convinced an entire nation, and even the whole world, that she was a brilliant scientist while having just a basic elementary education. But how does a peasant girl from rural Romania transform herself into one of the most feared and despised figures of the 20th century? The story did not begin with a rise in power. It began way before that, in a backwards rural village of Romania. Early years and humble beginnings. In a backwater village of Petresti and the Dâmbovița county of Wallachia, Lenuța Petrescu was born into a peasant family on January 7, 1916. However, the world she was born into offered little promise for a girl, especially one born into the grinding poverty that defined rural Romania between the wars. Her father, Alexandru, was a plowman who worked other men's fields for coins that barely kept his family alive. Elena learned early that survival demanded ruthlessness and that tenderness was a luxury her world couldn't afford. When it was time to start schooling, Elena was enrolled into a school around where she lived. The schoolhouse in Petresti was a crumbling structure where children sat on wooden benches. But despite this, Elena attended sporadically. Harvest seasons and family emergencies always took precedence over education for Elena, and by the time she was 11, she had completely abandoned her studies, effectively ending her education at 4th grade. She could barely read, struggled with arithmetic, and her handwriting remained childishly crude throughout her life. But even at that, Elena possessed something that would prove far more valuable than literacy, a burning ambition that seemed to consume her from within. While other girls her age accepted their fate of marriage and motherhood, Elena wanted something more that lay beyond the borders of her tiny village. At 14, Elena made a decision that would change everything. With nothing but a bundle of clothes and an iron determination, she boarded a train to Bucharest, the capital city of Romania. The town city was an upgrade from her crude life, and it sprawled before her like a glittering promise of electric lights, paved streets, and most importantly, escape from the suffocating poverty of Petresti. A new beginning. Transiting from the village to town was not an easy one for Elena, as Bucharest in the 1930s was a city of stark contrasts. Grand boulevards lined with elegant cafes existed mere blocks from squalid tenements, where rural migrants crowded into rooms that reeked of desperation. But soon enough, Elena found work in a textile factory, her hands growing raw from handling coarse fabrics 12 hours a day, for wages that barely covered rent in a shared room. The factory floor was Elena's real education. For among the clacking looms and clouds of cotton dust, she learned that power came not from books or breeding, but from knowing exactly when to submit and when to strike. She watched foremen intimidate workers, saw how fear could be wielded like a weapon, and observed the delicate dance between oppressor and oppressed. During brief work breaks, her fellow workers whispered about politics and the Iron Guard's brutal nationalism, about the Communist Party's promises of equality, about the growing tensions across Europe. Elena listened carefully, saying little but absorbing everything. She began to understand that ideology was just another tool, another path to power for those clever enough to use it. At the age of 23 in 1939, Elena joined the Communist Party. Her motives were pragmatic rather than ideological. By witnessing how party membership opened doors, provided protection, and offered advancement opportunities unavailable to ordinary citizens, she longed to be a part of that circle. She threw herself into party activities with the same fierce determination that had driven her from the village, attending meetings, distributing leaflets, and building the network of connections that would later prove invaluable. The meeting that changed history. In a smoky backroom of a cafe in Bucharest, the stage was set for a romance that would terrorize a nation in years to come. It was the year 1939, and somehow, 23-year-old Elena, who had become hardened by the years of factory work and underground political activity, met Nicolae Ceausescu. 21-year-old Nicolae, who was born in 1918, was a young communist organizer who was fresh out of the nest. But what drew them together was the intensity and ambition they both shared. In his life, Nicolae had spent years engaging in communist activities during the war. Now, he possessed the lean hunger of a true believer, someone who saw revolution not as ideology, but as destiny. The couple began courting shortly after, and their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of Romania's political transformation. As Soviet forces occupied the country and the Communist Party maneuvered for control, Elena and Nicolae found in each other perfect complements, his ideological fervor balanced by her practical ruthlessness, his charisma enhanced by her calculating intelligence. But there was just one problem. Nicolae kept getting into trouble, and he was always in and out of prison. Regardless, the couple got married in 1945. Elena understood that she had married not just a man, but a pathway to the kind of power she had dreamed of since childhood. So while Nicolae had several run-ins with the law, she stayed by his side. While in prison, Nicolae met and latched onto his cellmate and communist leader, prompting his escape from prison in 1944. Back in the real world, Nicolae served as the secretary of the Union of Communist Youth from 1944 to 1946, thus beginning his life in politics and heralding his and Elena's rise to power. The early years of power. The early years of communist rule in Romania were brutal. The new regime dismantled the old order with systematic violence, executions, imprisonments, and seizures of property that reduced entire families to destitution overnight. Elena watched from increasingly privileged positions as her husband climbed the party hierarchy, learning lessons that would serve her well in the decades to come. She observed how fear could be manufactured and maintained, how propaganda could reshape reality in people's minds, and how loyalty could be bought and betrayal punished. While Nicolae focused on ideological matters and grand political strategy, Elena paid attention to the mechanics of control, the networks of informants, the careful distribution of privileges, and the art of making people complicit in their own oppression. In 1948, their son Valentin was born, followed by Zoya in 1949 and Nicu in 1951. But motherhood never softened Elena's edges. If anything, having children only intensified her determination to secure power and position. She understood viscerally that in communist Romania, privilege was the only protection, that political position meant the difference between comfort and catastrophe for her family. Throughout the 1950s, as Nicolae consolidated his power within the party apparatus, Elena began building her own parallel influence. She cultivated relationships with wives of other high officials, established herself as someone who could grant or deny favors, and slowly, but systematically created a network of obligations and debts that would later prove worthy. A scientific fraud. By the early 1960s, Elena had identified her path to independent power, and that was science. In a communist system that officially venerated technical expertise and industrial progress, scientific achievement offered prestige and authority that even political position couldn't always provide. But there was just one problem. Elena knew nothing about science. Her solution was audacious but very simple. She would simply pretend to be a scientist. With Nicolae's growing influence protecting her from scrutiny, Elena enrolled at a local polytechnic to study chemistry. But rather than attending lectures or conducting research, she relied on a system of ghostwriters, stand-in exam takers, and intimidated professors who understood that failing the future First Lady would end their careers. In 1967, Elena was promoted as a scientist and even awarded a doctorate degree in chemistry. Her doctoral dissertation was almost certainly written by actual chemists who worked under threat and inducement, and the defense of her thesis in 1967 was a carefully orchestrated performance where committee members asked predetermined questions to which Elena had rehearsed answers, and any genuine scientific inquiry was smoothly diverted. But Elena's scientific fraud went far beyond a single degree. Back in the early 1960s, she was said to be the secretary of the party committee of the Bucharest Central Institute of Chemical Researches. But after her husband became the party leader in 1965, Elena was listed as the director of the institute, but that was only the beginning. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Elena accumulated an astounding array of academic honors and professional positions. She became a member of the Romanian Academy, received honorary doctorates from universities, published dozens of research papers she had never read, and eventually rose to become director of the Institute for Chemistry of Macromolecular Compounds. Along with that, she was credited as co-inventor of several patents. International scientific conferences became elaborate theatrical productions designed to maintain Elena's scholarly facade. Romanian diplomats would arrange for her to receive honorary degrees and awards, while the few genuine scientists who interacted with her learned to mask their amazement at her profound ignorance behind polite smiles and careful silence. The expansion of power. As Nicolae assumed leadership of Romania in 1965, Elena's influence expanded exponentially. She was no longer just the wife of a powerful man, she had become a power center in her own right. Her scientific credentials, however fraudulent, provided legitimacy for her involvement in economic planning and industrial policy. Her position within the party structure gave her control over personnel decisions that affected millions of lives. Nicolae's independent foreign policy, maintaining relations with both East and West, and refusing to participate in the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, had earned international praise and domestic support. But Elena understood that popular approval was dangerous, that it made leaders complacent and vulnerable. She began systematically undermining any potential rivals within the party hierarchy. Officials who showed too much independence found themselves transferred to insignificant positions. Those who displayed competence that might threaten the Ceausescu monopoly on power discovered that their careers had reached unexpected dead ends. Elena's approach was subtle but relentless. She rarely destroyed enemies outright. Instead, she preferred to marginalize them slowly, making their downfall seem like natural political evolution. Her control extended to the most intimate details of government policy. Foreign dignitaries learned that securing Romania's cooperation often required courting Elena separately from Nicolae. She maintained her own network of international contacts, her own channels of information, and her own sources of leverage that she guarded jealously, even from her husband. Mother of the nation. With the Ceausescus in power in the 1970s, Romania had become a laboratory for one of history's most twisted experiments in manufactured worship. The Ceausescu regime began constructing an elaborate cult of personality that elevated not just Nicolae, but Elena as well, to positions of almost divine authority. State television broadcasts featured lengthy segments praising Elena's scientific achievements. Newspapers published breathless accounts of her latest research breakthroughs and scientific innovations. Her birthday became a national celebration, with children across the country forced to memorize poems in her honor. The most obscene manifestation of this manufactured adoration was Elena's adoption of the title Mother of the Nation. This designation transformed her from a mere political figure into something approaching a religious icon. Propaganda portrayed her as the caring, nurturing guardian of Romania's children, the wise scientific mind guiding the country's industrial development, the devoted wife supporting her husband's visionary leadership. And that was only the half of it. Romanian citizens were required to display portraits of both Nicolae and Elena in their homes. Public buildings featured massive photographs of the couple, often depicted in loving embrace or gazing confidently toward a bright socialist future. The regime produced countless books, films, and songs celebrating Elena's wisdom, beauty, and maternal devotion. But underneath this manufactured worship was a system of control that penetrated every aspect of Romanian life. Elena's network of informants, including housekeepers, secretaries, chauffeurs, and even family members, reported on conversations and activities throughout the elite circles of Bucharest. A carelessly critical comment about the First Lady could result in job loss, apartment reassignment, or worse. Behind every man. Elena's true masterpiece was not any scientific discovery, but the construction of one of the 20th century's most comprehensive surveillance states. Working closely with the Securitate and Romania's secret police, she created a system that turned neighbor against neighbor, child against parent, friend against friend. The numbers were staggering. By the 1980s, 1 in 30 Romanians was either a Securitate officer or an informant. Every apartment building had its watchers, every workplace its spies, every social gathering its hidden listeners. Elena personally reviewed reports on thousands of individuals, deciding fates with casual cruelty that revealed the peasant girl's complete transformation into something inhuman. Her paranoia knew no bounds. She suspected plots everywhere, among government officials, within her own family, even among household staff. Servants who had worked for the Ceausescus for years found themselves suddenly dismissed and investigated based on Elena's irrational fears. She ordered the installation of listening devices in guest rooms at official residences, and even in private homes, recording the private conversations of visiting dignitaries and their spouses, as well as their sexual activities in their homes. But it was the psychological warfare that was even more devastating than the physical oppression. Elena understood that breaking people's spirits was more effective than simply punishing their bodies. A minister who pleased Elena might find his children admitted to elite schools and his wife invited to exclusive social functions. But the same official could lose everything overnight if he fell from favor, his children expelled, his family ostracized, his career destroyed. This constant fear of losing status made even the most powerful Romanians desperate to curry Elena's favor. But while Elena basked in manufactured glory, the country she helped rule was sliding toward economic collapse. She put herself at all important political gatherings and discussions. But her interference in industrial planning, based on her fictional scientific expertise, led to disasters that cost billions of dollars and countless lives. She championed massive petrochemical projects that proved technically unfeasible, ordered the construction of factories that produced unusable products, and insisted on agricultural policies that ignored basic principles of soil science and crop rotation. When these projects failed, she blamed saboteurs, foreign agents, or incompetent subordinates, never acknowledging her own role in the disasters. The beginning of the end. The late 1980s brought winds of change sweeping across Eastern Europe. In Poland, solidarity challenged communist authority. In Hungary, reforms were dismantling one-party rule. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were transforming the communist world. But in Romania, Elena and Nicolae viewed these changes as threats rather than opportunities. While other communist leaders adapted to shifting realities, the Ceausescus doubled down on repression and isolation. Elena particularly opposed any reforms that might limit her power or expose her scientific fraud to international scrutiny. While other Eastern European countries opened their borders and liberalized their economies, Romania became increasingly anachronistic, a Stalinist theme park frozen in the 1950s, while the rest of the communist world evolved. But how did it all begin? In 1981, Nicolae and Elena began an austerity program to liquidate Romania's national debt of $10 billion. To make this happen, strict policies were implemented, and which included rationing basic amenities. Within months, ordinary Romanians faced shortages of basic necessities, food, heating fuel, medical supplies, and even cooking gas, while resources were diverted to Elena's vanity projects and the regime's increasingly elaborate propaganda apparatus. Hospitals lacked antibiotics while the state spent millions on Elena's scientific conferences. Children suffered from malnutrition while food was exported to pay for the regime's foreign debts. Elena remained completely insulated from these hardships. She lived in palaces stocked with imported luxuries, traveled in private jets, and wore jewelry worth more than most Romanians would earn in several lifetimes, all funded from the country's funds and the nation's pockets. But each act of repression only increased popular resentment, creating a cycle of violence that would ultimately consume the regime itself. Outbreak of disaster.
Ceausescu nu fi trist, Iliescu-i comunist. Ceausescu nu fi trist, Iliescu-i comunist.
The December of 1989 made history as the start of Romania's release from Ceausescu's oppression. The spark that ignited Romania's revolution came in Timișoara, where protests against the regime's religious policies started on December 16, 1989, and escalated into broader demonstrations against communist rule. What started out as peaceful protests of the citizens quickly spiraled out of control and turned violent. On December 21, 1989, Nicolae attempted to address a rally in Bucharest, confident that his presence would restore calm. Instead, the crowd turned hostile, chanting anti-regime slogans while Elena watched in horror from the balcony of the Central Committee building. For the first time, she was seeing the true face of popular opinion, not the manufactured adoration of state-sponsored events, but genuine hatred accumulated over decades of oppression. There was no going back, and from them, the Ceausescu's response was characteristically brutal. They ordered security forces to fire on demonstrators, apparently believing that a sufficient display of violence would restore order. Protesters were shot at, clubbed, and crushed by armored vehicles. In all, there were many casualties, including French journalist Jean-Louis Calderon and Belgian journalist Danny Hugh. But unlike what they planned, the massacre in Timișoara had the opposite effect. Images of killed protesters, smuggled out despite the regime's media blackout, shocked the world and galvanized the Romanian opposition. For the first time in decades, people across the country began to lose their fear of the Securitat's surveillance and repression. While the nation protested, the Ceausescus made a grave mistake, one that would cost them everything, including their lives. They stayed behind instead of leaving immediately. The end of an era. On December 22, 1989, the helicopter lifted off from the roof of the Central Committee building, carrying Elena and Nicolae away from the collapsing capital. But there was nowhere to run. The revolution had spread across Romania, and the couple who had once controlled every aspect of their nation's life now found themselves fugitives without allies or sanctuary. Their helicopter pilot, claiming problems, set down in a field near Târgoviste. Local officials, sensing the political winds, refused to help the former dictators. For the first time in decades, Elena found herself dependent on the mercy of ordinary Romanians, the same people she had spent her adult life oppressing and exploiting. With only 2 guards to protect them, the Ceausescus were ushered into a civilian's vehicle, who did not take the couple far before claiming engine problems. Once again, the couple were left to fend for themselves, but they were convinced to hide in an agricultural tech institute on the edge of town till the riot died down. While there, the couple were ushered to a room and locked in. They were arrested within hours, taken into custody by soldiers who showed none of the deference that had characterized Elena's interactions with security forces for decades. While they awaited trial, the couple had no access to aides, personal staff, or luxury. Elena, particularly agitated by the recent development, protested against the treatment they were receiving. But at that time, it had become clear to them both. The woman who had demanded to be addressed as Comrade Academician Dr. Engineer Elena Ceausescu was now just another prisoner, stripped of titles, honors, and the apparatus of power that had protected her from accountability. The trial of the century. The trial began on December 25, 1989, but it was no ordinary legal proceeding. It was a revolutionary tribunal, a moment of cathartic justice for a nation that had suffered under Elena and Nicolae's rule for more than 2 decades. Signed and approved by the new head of state, Elena faced the court with characteristic arrogance, initially refusing to recognize the tribunal's authority. But as the charges were read in the form of genocide, undermining state power, undermining the national economy, and trying to flee the country with national funds equaling $1 billion in foreign accounts, the magnitude of her crimes became undeniable. The trial lasted less than 2 hours, and the verdict was inevitable: death for both Elena and Nicolae. As they were led to execution, Elena's final words revealed the person she had always been beneath the manufactured image. She cursed her captors, demanded better treatment, and insisted that history would vindicate her. There was no repentance, no acknowledgement of the suffering she had caused, no recognition of her crimes against the Romanian people. Her last words were made in spite to the soldiers who led her to the wall, cursing them for treating her horribly, even after she raised them like a mother. Nicolae, on the other hand, did not share her hysterics and began singing quietly. But the execution of the Ceausescus remained one of the most shocking public executions in history. The firing squad, consisting of 3 paratroopers, started shooting as soon as the couple was positioned on a wall, and although a television crew was assigned to record the execution, it happened so fast that only the last round of shots were captured on camera. Later on, Prime Minister Petre Roman confirmed that the trial and execution were swift to prevent the couple from being rescued by loyalists. But the bullets that ended Elena Ceausescu's life on Christmas Day 1989 also ended one of the 20th century's most grotesque experiments in manufactured authority. The woman who had convinced a nation to worship her as a brilliant scientist and loving mother was revealed in death as what she had always been, a peasant girl whose hunger for power had transformed her into a monster. The aftermath. After Elena's execution, the full extent of her crimes began to emerge. Archives revealed the surveillance networks she had created, the economic disasters she had caused, and the lives she had destroyed through casual cruelty and systematic oppression. Perhaps most shocking was the revelation of her scientific fraud. International experts who examined her alleged research found it to be largely plagiarized or completely fabricated. The academic honors she had accumulated were revealed as products of diplomatic pressure and political intimidation, rather than genuine scientific achievement. The woman who had styled herself as Romania's greatest scientist had never conducted a single legitimate experiment, never made a meaningful contribution to human knowledge, and never deserved any of the accolades that had been heaped upon her by a terrorized academic community. But Elena Ceaușescu was more than just personal fraud and political oppression. She had helped create a system that corrupted an entire society, turning citizens into informants, children into government spies, neighbors into enemies. The psychological damage she inflicted on Romania would take generations to heal. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.